Episode 9, Meanwhile, at Bowser's Castle. A hot wind blew throughout the barren, volcanic regions of the Koopa Kingdom, a burning wind which flew past the fiery peaks of the volcanoes and the massive battleships, endlessly patrolling the skies for trespassers, and down over the enormous lakes of lava until it reached the settlement known as Flame City. Flame City was a product of the modern age. Something which never could have happened in the days where Mario and Bowser fought almost daily. It was a beautiful, quaint city, its streets made of cobblestone and the roofs of its houses covered in colored tiles. Canals of lava ran next to the city streets, the citizens of the town crossing them over bridges decorated with images of the Koopa Emperor. They severed no defensive purpose at all. They simply helped create Flame City's unique aesthetic. It was a city for those honored by the Koopa Empire. The families of war veterans, the prized soldiers of the army, and others who had given their livelihood to the Empire. Overlooking the city, perched on a hill of brown volcanic rock, was Bowser's Castle, looking the same as it had for decades, with its green-roofed towers, spiked dome, and entrance in the shape of Bowser's head. Only it wasn't technically Bowser's Castle anymore, since the Koopa Emperor had long since moved his place of residence to the new Koopa Empire capital of Koopa Central. The Koopa who owned the castle, however, still bore the name of Bowser, even if it was a generation down. Crown Prince Bowser Koopa Jr. was feeling rather glum. He sat on the spiked throne of the castle overlooking the throne room, drumming his claws on the armrest. The throne room hadn't changed a bit since Mario had last set foot inside. It was still lit by tall, Gothic windows and golden chandeliers, and decorated with a massive rug depicting the Koopa Troop's emblem. Behind the throne was a massive stone statue of Bowser, rising up to the ceiling to show just how powerful the king of the Koopas was. There was even the wooden bridge which spanned the channel of lava that separated the room in two. The bridge which Mario had destroyed so many times, Junior had often wondered why his father hadn't just invested in a sturdier material. It wasn't like that really mattered, though, he reflected, since they'd come out on top in the end. While the castle was more or less the same, Prince Junior himself had changed significantly. The Koopa Prince was very clearly no longer a child. In fact, he looked nearly identical to his father now. The only differences were that he had slightly less hair on his head, which was still done up in his signature ponytail, and that he wore a metal breastplate with the image of his jaws on it, as a sort of homage to the bandana he had worn as a kid. Bowser Jr. overlooked the room with his shining scarlet eyes, glancing at the military officers who were gathered there before him on the black and white checkered floor. The sun was setting, and the orange light shone through the windows, casting shadows on the ground. He adjusted himself on his throne so that he sat up straighter. This was the same throne his father had ruled the Koopa Kingdom from, although these days that meant less. Bowser's Castle was the main seat of power in Sector 8, the sector of the Mushroom World which consisted of the Koopa Kingdom, Mushroom Kingdom, and Bean Kingdom. It was a mark of his dad's favoritism that Junior had been allowed to rule it.
Dad!
Bowser Jr. reflected as he waited for one of the officers to say something.
What are you thinking right now?
He hadn't heard from his father in nearly a year. True, governing the entire world was a lot of work, but it was still something to worry about. Emperor Bowser's condition seemed to be getting worse and worse every year.
It's all because of Mama Peach,
he thought to himself, still using the childish nickname out of habit.
Why is it that we control the entire world and have an entire elite division dedicated to finding her, and we still don't have a clue where she is?
Bowser Jr. still had trouble wrapping his head around the fact that he hadn't seen the princess for 20 years. It was as if she was dead. In fact, he had long realized, she probably was. It was strange, having somebody take up so much of your life and then disappear like that. If only he had known that the last time he had kidnapped her would also be the last time he'd see her.
Wish I had time to help everyone track her down,
he mused, tightening his hand into a fist.
Somehow, though, I don't think I'm going to get much of that anytime soon.
One of the officers approached the raised platform where Bowser Jr. sat, and kneeled. He was a coup patrol, made distinct from the other coup patrols in the army by the orange emblem of Bowser Jr. which was on his helmet's forehead. The coup patrol's name was General Spiker, and he was the highest-ranked officer in Bowser Jr.'s private army, being one of the 20 generals who made up Koopa High Command.
Prince Bowser Jr.,
Spiker said submissively.
I have news of the incident in District 2.
I see. Bowser Jr. replied, closing his eyes. District 2. That was Morton's district. He had heard the rumors circulating among the troops that there had been an emergency dispatch to all corners of Sarasa land and that all of Morton's troops were on high alert. He hadn't been able to seriously consider the issue until now, however.
Well, don't just stand there,
he said, opening his eyes and gesturing for the general to continue speaking.
What's the story? Is it a rebellion? Like that Fire Flower group or something? If it is Fire Flower, they've become craftier,
Spiker replied seriously, still kneeling before the throne.
We have photographic evidence to confirm that the invaders bore the emblem of Prince Roy. What?
Bowser Jr. exclaimed, his eyes widening. He gripped the armrests so hard he was afraid the bronze metal on them didn't shatter. He immediately knew that this was no the work of Fire Flower. Roy Koopa. He had always been a bully. From popping Lemmy's favorite ball to ripping apart Wendy's brand new pearl necklace, he had always been the sort who enjoyed causing pain.
This was a disaster waiting to happen,
Junior thought grimly as he fought to keep his usually fiery temper under control. He couldn't throw tantrums like he used to, after all.
I knew he'd get tired of tormenting his subjects eventually and move on to his original victims again.
But even as he thought this, Bowser Jr. knew something was off. This wasn't simple playground bullying like Roy had used to do. He couldn't just waltz in and start punching people when the person he was trying to torment had an entire nation behind his or her back. Tormenting a nation would mean starting a war. And was Roy even stupid enough to risk becoming the target of not only all his other siblings, but his father as well? Wars were expensive and always carried the highest stakes. When he had last spoken to Roy, nearly 9 years ago, since the two were anything but close, his older brother had seemed satisfied with lording over the Sand Kingdom from his new capital of Neon City. Would he really risk all that for some childish bullying?
He's not alone in this,
Bowser Jr. realized, his eyes narrowing into slits as he thought of the one Koopa who would be most likely to stir up some familial drama.
Ludwig von Koopa,
he hissed to himself.
Sir?
Spiker asked in confusion.
What's Prince Ludwig got to do with this?
Bowser Jr. rose and began to pace back and forth before his throne, trying to think out the scenario.
He's behind this. He has to be.
Junior mused aloud, both to himself and the Koopa Troll. He tightened his fist as he realized the cruelty of the situation.
Dad? The Emperor's condition must have got him thinking about the succession again.
He spoke angry, his red eyes darting around the room at the officers who were watching him.
If he isn't going to get the throne by law, he's going to take it by force. I always knew he'd pull a stunt like this.
Bowser Jr. quickly racked his brain for a solution. Morton and him were rather close and their districts had always been closely aligned. To not send help would be a complete betrayal of his older brother. Knowing Roy, the enemy force would be extremely powerful. And, more often than not, Ludwig would be involved, which would mean unique tactics and advanced weaponry. Should he send his entire fleet to deal with the issue? No. That would leave District 8 open for attack. He had to play it safe here. Should he send half the fleet? Perhaps it could be enough, since it would have all of Morton's army backing it. but Bowser Jr. wasn't going to be taking any gambles.
General Spiker, I want you to put Royal Decree 58 into action, right now.
He quickly ordered, causing the Koopa Patrol to snap to attention with a smart salute.
Forced conscription of all able-bodied citizens?
Spiker asked.
Even? Yes.
Bowser Jr. growled, stepping forward, his feet shaking the floor as he descended the stairs leading down from his throne.
This isn't the old Koopa Kingdom anymore, Nathaniel Spiker. We're the International Koopa Empire. It's time we open up the doors to our military. Toads, Piantas, Yoshis, Kongs. I want them drafted just the same as the Koopas, Goombas, and the rest of them. It'll swell our army to twice the size and allow us to bring stability to the Empire once again. As you wish, Prince Bowser Jr.
Spiker replied, sharply turning around and walking towards the ground of lower-ranked officers.
Cali Coop!
He shouted at one lackey too, who was smartly dressed in a military jacket.
I want the decree playing on every channel in the Koopa Kingdom. Yes, even the cartoon ones. Not even the poorest tramp in the Neo-Bowser City slums is going to miss this.
He spun around to a blue-robed shy guy.
James. Inform Governor Flame and Governor Mascot about our prince's orders and see to it that they spread the news in the Mushroom and Bean Kingdoms. Step to it. Yes, sir.
The two officers saluted. Bowser Jr. turned away and walked back up to his throne. The rumble of the volcanoes sounded in the difference, although Bowser Jr. barely registered it since it was the sound that he had been hearing all his life. He turned his gaze upwards to stare at the massive, imposing statue of his father. Despite not being the oldest or even second oldest of the Koopalings, he was his father's chosen heir. One day, he was going to rule the entire world.
I'm not going to let you down, Dad.
He thought to himself, smirking despite the dark omens the evening had brought.
If you think I'm going to let your empire crumble around you, you don't know me at all.